In Parshat Terumah, we are introduced to the Mishkan, this portable sanctuary that we built and in which we worshipped during our stay in the desert. It's the blueprint upon which the Beit HaMikdash is ultimately created. It's our paradigm of sacred space. And in these opening verses, as the Mishkan is introduced, the Torah says, "Vasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocha," make for me a sanctuary, make a sacred space for me, v'shachanti b'tocham, and I shall dwell amongst them. What does that mean, I shall dwell amongst them? So the Or Chaim HaKadosh points out, v'lo amar b'tocho, that God didn't say, make this sacred space, make this Mishkan, make this temple, and I will dwell there in it. It says, I will dwell amongst them. So a simple reading, I think maybe this is Pshat, or Chaim says, Shemakom asher yakdishu l'shachno yihya mitoch b'nei Yisrael sheyakifu hamishkan b'dalad degalim. Meaning that the Mishkan has to be in the encampment of Israel, okay? You can't just build it in some random location, even in the wilderness, even in the desert as it's being moved, as it's a portable sanctuary, it still has to be surrounded by the Israelite camp. And so when God dwells in the sanctuary, therefore, God is dwelling amongst the Israelite community. We are surrounding the Mishkan itself. But I think there's a greater significance to Shachanti b'tocham, I will dwell in their midst. And that's not referring to the Mishkan being surrounded by the Israelite community, but that through our construction of the Mishkan, we engage in that building project in such a way that when we are successful in making a sacred space, God is dwelling among us. Okay, this is alluded to quite explicitly by the Terumah, who I've quoted the Terumah before, really incredible commentary on the Torah. He collected all of his favorite midrashim. He went through rabbinic literature, and the pieces that he thought were the best, he kind of included in his book, verse by verse, as he goes through the 5 books of Moses. I think he wrote it to give people something to look at and read if they got bored during Shul. And then that would have been nice enough, but then he also adds incredible footnotes in which he explains the underlying logic that he's been able to reconstruct of what is animating the midrashic interpretation and expansion of the verse in the Torah itself. So he's connecting the midrashic tradition, the classical rabbinic tradition, and the verses of the Torah itself. So he quotes a ancient tradition from Votzer Rabbi Natan, Tanya Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Tarfon says, Gedolah Melacha, creative labor, Melacha, is wondrous, is great. She'av HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lo hishra shchinato al Yisrael, ad she'asu Melacha, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't cause God's own presence, the Shekhinah, to dwell upon Israel until we did Melacha, until we engaged in creative labor. Shemar v'esuli mikdash, make for me a mikdash, make a sacred space, v'shachanti b'tocham, and then I'll dwell amongst them. That's Rabbi Tarfon is quoted by Avot Rabbi Natan in an ancient text. The Terumah adds, Yitachen demidayek l'fi hamishkan l'fi hashech lashon ha'inyan hav'lemar v'shachanti b'tocho v'lo b'tocham. I would have expected the Torah to say, make a mikdash for me, according to all the details that are comprising chapter after chapter after chapter of Sefer Shemot and Sefer Vayikra and Sefer Midbar. Okay, all those details. I will dwell in that house. But it doesn't say that, even though I would have expected. It says betocham, in their midst. Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, doesn't need a house. Isaiah taught us that in chapter 66 of Isaiah. Hashemayim kisi, va'aretz hadom ragli, eza bayet asher tivnuli. The heavens are my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What house could you build for me, says God? Ela inyan hu sheretza Kadosh Baruch Hu yitasku Yisrael b'melechat avoda lishmo. Kadosh Baruch Hu wanted us to be involved in melechat avoda, in creative labor for God's sake. V'yitzavem al binyan hamikdash u'mitoch shetiyeh chaviv alav avodat pulatam yishrash she'eto b'tocham b'chol makom shehem. That it was so treasured by God that we would engage in this effort on God's behalf. That wherever that Mishkan was built, whatever location we were, as we traveled through the wilderness, God's presence rested upon us in the merit of our constructing the Mishkan. And that's why Rabbi Tarfon says, Malacha, creative work, effort, human initiative is wondrous, is great, because Shetzmurata, in exchange for that effort, Chanan Kadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael b'hashrat shchinato. Kadosh Baruch Hu graced Israel with God's presence. I am speaking to you this morning, recording this video from our Mikdash, our sacred space, our Mikdash Ma'at, our minor sanctuary. And we're coming on a year since we had to shut our building on March 13th, a date that I will never forget. But although we had to shut our sanctuary for a period of months, our community endured, our Shul community never shut down, and the holiness that we're able to create was never diminished, okay? Because God's presence never was confined to a space. Even though there was the Beit HaMikdash, there was the Mishkan, there are shuls, which are spaces where we seek God's presence, which we endow with extra sanctity, but God's presence always was meant b'tocham, okay? It was meant to dwell among them, okay? Among us, okay? In return for our actions and our endeavors and our efforts. And our efforts to build the Mishkan merited God dwelling God's presence among us, and our efforts now to live lives of Torah and mitzvot, lives of meaning, lives of holiness, lives dedicated to solidarity with one another, concern for one another, friendship, acts of chesed, acts of tzedakah. That causes God's presence to dwell among us. We've seen a shul without walls this past year. And thank God, inside the walls of this building now, prayers happen every week. And in the future weeks, more of you, hopefully, will be able to come back to this building and we'll be able to pray, more of us and more of us and more of us at the same time, closer together in the same building. But the shul transcends walls. God's presence never was meant to be confined to a location. God's presence rests on us when we dedicate ourselves, our actions, our lives to mitzvot, to kedusha, to Torah, to one another. And I wish you a Shabbat Shalom. I wish you a joyous Purim, and I wish you much success in this endeavor, this task that God entrusted to our ancestors thousands of years ago and that endures. Asuli Mikdash, make sacred places for God. Endow the world with holiness. V'shachanti b'tocham, and in turn God promises to dwell among us. Shabbat Shalom.